Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Growth with Podcast with your boys. I'm Pierce. We have John Marco, Jason, Rob, and special guest Connor Bronsdon today joining us.
What's up, y'all?
Thanks for being here, all of you. It is also we have John Marco, Jason, Rob. Yeah. Oh shoot, I got my the stream going. Anyway, so it is also Veterans Day today. So happy Veterans Day to
Happy Veterans Day. And especially happy Veterans Day to Pierce. Thank you for your service, my friend.
Pierce, my dad. Anyone else out there that listens to us?
Dude, cheers, Pierce.
So, actually, you know what? We could talk about that for a minute. So, every year, restaurants will have like Veterans Day appreciation something, you know? And to a lot of these places, it's just another marketing gimmick. It's like a buy one meal, get one free. It's just like another coupon. But to a lot of restaurants, it's like a straight up, hey, here's a free meal. All right, like Denny's is famous for it because they've been doing it for like since World War II or something. I made up that number, but like they've been doing it forever. And it's like you get a free Grand Slam, all right, over at Denny's. So like lots of different restaurants do this. And me, myself, I've always felt super awkward actually trying to like go get a free meal. Then like, hey, so I don't mean to be like cheap or rude or whatever, but I heard you have free food, right? You know, it feels really awkward. I didn't feel like I did anything special in particular to like deserve it personally anyway, right? But you know, I'm thinking, all right, tonight I decided to go out for dinner. I decided to take up Olive Garden on their free menu. This is literally the second time that I've been to a sit-down restaurant since February. All right, so not exactly a frequent of the restaurants you're seeing. And I get paired across the room, like so, adjacent table next to me practically, is another veteran, and this dude is just being rude as all heck to whatever imaginary people he's talking about on his phone. He's not being rude to the waitress. He's basically like ignoring the waitress. But he's just being super judgy, saying like, you don't deserve that. And again, like whatever imaginary people. I'm thinking, great. And thinking about veterans is you can peg other veterans. You can tell who they are. So I'm thinking, great. This dude's going on. And I'm silently judging him. That's another thing veterans will do. We will totally judge other veterans for basically not being in like the same shape that they were when they're in the military. It's totally something that we do. So anyway, I'm judging this guy silently for basically being a jerk. I'm a jerk myself in my own head. I admit it. All right, but I'm judging him. And then eventually he calls up this other restaurant while he's in the middle of his own meal. And he's like, hey, so could I get your menu on the phone, please, and get a free meal to pick up? And he's doing this in the middle of his current meal in Olive Garden.
Wow.
And I'm just thinking, like, this is like the second time in my life I've taken up the free meal offer. And here I am sitting across this guy that's like gaming the system to get like the maximum free meals possible.
Gaming this is for real. I got this one day to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I can see how that he is, I guess, rightfully taking advantage for something that is offered to him. But, you know, that kind of makes me think about some thoughts I have on Veterans Day. Like, I appreciate people that, you know, serve the public and everything. But I'm personally the kind of person that just because you serve our country doesn't equate to, like, you know, blind appreciation and loyalty to your character.
Yeah. You go in firsthand. You see plenty of people that you're thinking, yeah, you should not be wearing the uniform. And that's what happens in any large organization, no matter what. There's no way that you can get like 100% like good people everywhere, right? Like people are not 100% good. So, I mean, that's just how it ends up working out. I would say if you want to thank a veteran, I think the best thing that you can do is be a citizen that's worth fighting for. You know?
I love that.
That's a good phrase.
Yeah, but you're free to use it.
I'm going to borrow that one, yeah.
Really awesome.
You know, I probably will borrow that.
We're all running to our Twitters right now.
We'll edit a quick clip of this and then share and have it go viral or something. But that's really awesome, yeah. Because at the end of the day, a good public servant in the armed forces is serving. I guess I would say all the good things that this country stands for, and we would only do it justice by living those values as the people that they are fighting for. That's smart. That's powerful.
Exactly.
So, what do you say to the folks that maybe in regards to like stuff like the NFL, where you saw Kaepernick kneeling, and you've got this kind of discourse from some veterans saying, this is what we fought for, this ability to protest, and others are saying, oh, it's disrespectful to the flag. How do we deal with that kind of conversation, or as a veteran, what would you say is the way that we should go about addressing those conversations?
Well, I definitely don't speak for all veterans.
Fair.
For myself, I would also be in that camp that says, like, no, that is actually, I would say, one of the best forms of protest that I could think. Because to me, choosing to take a knee is itself a sign of respect. You are simply doing it in a different way than what our society conforms to, which is putting your hand over your heart, right? So you are basically rebelling against the common norm to draw attention to yourself and draw attention to why you're doing it. So in the case of Colin Kaepernick, Black Lives Matter and police brutality. But you're doing it still in a different form of respect. And to me, I'm thinking like, I can't think of a better protest than that. I really, I can't. Is the perfect protest in my opinion. And people getting upset about it, I guess I understand, because you're getting upset out of a sense of patriotic duty. But patriotic duty taken a step too far can turn into blind nationalism. And sometimes the government does something that you actually shouldn't support.
It seems to speak to the divide in the country too, where depending on which media market you are in, whether you're getting Fox News and QAnon socials, your perspective on these issues is very different. Even if you had very similar upbringing, very similar service in the military, you could come out of that and say, well, the media I'm being exposed to here portrays this as disrespectful, and the other says, well, this is a way of trying to be respectful, but also showing protest and talking about Black Lives Matter. And I think it's a really strong symbol of that divide, both for veterans and also for the country overall.
Yeah. You're probably aware that Colin Kaepernick, before he started taking a knee, he started by just normally sitting on the bench with his hands just lying there, And I'm not gonna lie, first time I saw that, I was like, that dude's disrespectful. He basically thinks he's too good to stand up to the flag. I didn't know why he was doing it, but I see him there, and my immediate impression is, oh, he thinks he's better than everyone else. That's my immediate impression, right? But apparently, one of the some Navy SEAL reached out to him and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about this." And said, I support your right to protest, but it would go over a lot better for you and with the rest of us if you just decided to take a knee. And Colin Kaepernick's like, yeah, I can do that. So then he started taking a knee. And I just told you my first impression of taking a knee. I'm like, that's, again, another form of respect. So I totally was on board with that change.
Yeah, and I do think that change did make a difference in some folks' minds, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. Is it came from someone in the military, that idea of taking that knee.
Yeah.
Saying this will be the best way to go forward with it. So if people actually took a step back and was instead of just responding with anger and frustration, and they looked at where it came from, they'll realize, oh wait, he did speak to somebody who was from the military. So, and he did in saying to me.
Yeah. So the thing in military ceremonies is if you were to rank it, taking a knee is more respectful than saluting, or the civilian equivalent of putting your hand over your heart. When you present the flag of a lost and buried service member to their next of kin, you do so on your knee.
No.
Right? There's only very rare occasion for someone to be taking a knee, and it is almost always in memorial to someone.
Well, and even when you just look at it from a football perspective, and I'm sorry to cut you off, Pierce.
No, you're good.
That's what players will do if someone's injured on the field. It's kind of that same idea of this is someone that's hurt, someone that's wounded. Let's recognize that and draw attention to it. So I think there's definitely a parallel there.
Yeah, absolutely right. So on a completely different note, before you shove another taco in your face, Connor. So you were requested to be on our show by one of our fans, Sue. Thank you for
watching.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm glad you did.
Pleasure.
Tell us, I guess, and everybody watching, a bit about your background and your green podcast.
Sure. So thank you for plugging me first. So I have a background in political consulting. I spent about 8 years working full-time in politics, working mostly with Democratic campaigns, including Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal back in 2016, some statewide campaigns in Washington State. I've done work in Texas and Maryland as well. And I came out of the 2016 cycle really disillusioned for a variety of reasons. Took a bit of a break and started doing more work in the tech space, something I've always been interested and passionate about, particularly around digital campaigning and the need to change how our government interacts with technology. So over the past 4 years, I've done more and more work with Microsoft, where I've done a bunch of work with them around digital transformation. And I also work in green policy and have, I guess, for about 10 years now, where I've done work on green policy and organizing. And so out of that, over the last couple of years, I've been writing for places like The Urbanist, Future Zen Business Journal, Planet Zen, talking about, like green policy. And I'm watching a podcast, Growing the Green Economy, coming out here later in November. You can follow us on Twitter at Green Economy Pod. And we'll be talking about different ways that the Biden administration and the country as a broader whole can take this kind of intersection of green policy, economic development, and a sustainable future and push it together, because there are things that there's huge potential on. So, for example, mass timber. I don't know if any of you guys have heard about this movement, but it's a series of new timber technologies for construction that has a potential for things like carbon capture within the building, more efficient and speedy construction, and creating sustainably managed forests, or looking at passive house sustainable design, and a lot of other stuff that's happening. So I'm kind of, because of my background in both tech and politics, I've had hey Sue, I've had a kind of intersection point that I think is fairly unique, and it's one thing that I love about folks like Andrew Yang, is that perspective of taking policy and what's happening in technology and putting it together. And so that's where my background is. That's where I write a lot about that. You can see me ramble about it on Twitter, and I'll be talking about it more in the podcast.
All right,
that's
very cool.
Awesome, Connor. So my immediate first question for you actually would be, so in terms of green tech and green policy, how would you construct messaging to push that forward in, let's say, the upcoming Biden administration, and even assuming a Republican-controlled Senate, in a way that's very bipartisan?
Well, I do think the Build Back Better message that the Biden crew have been pushing is solid. I think they need to do a better job in some sections around it, but I mean, overall, they still won the election. I think there's a lot of potential to that idea, because what they're really pushing on, and I think that the selling point is that, we can create new jobs and improve the economy. Look at their, weatherization program, for as one example, where they're expecting over 1 million jobs to be created by that weatherization program. We can make our buildings, our country, our economy more sustainable, and we can build and reinforce the things that we need, things like infrastructure, transit, and the massive amount of buildings and homes that we need. So the United Nations actually did a study on this, which is that every year over the next 20 plus years, they're going to be a new Paris built. Every day. They're going to build essentially the size of a new Paris is being built. And so there's so much construction that needs to happen. We can do that in a sustainable way that also builds clean, green jobs. So I think there needs to be this intersection point where we say, okay, we're going to build, we're going to do it in a way that grows the economy, and grows the economy particularly in rural areas. And that's one thing that places like mass timber has a huge opportunity. And we're going to do it sustainably. And sustainable can message to liberals, to folks in cities. Building is also obviously crucial for everyone throughout the country. And then the economic side, I think, is where you see a lot of hard-hit rural counties that really empathize with this and say, oh, this is something that can appeal to me, particularly with folks in fossil fuels. There's an opportunity to really make a difference in people's lives, and it takes getting to have real conversations with these folks, and that's where I think you have opportunities with deep canvassing and real organizing to make a difference in a lot of these communities. And I'm hopeful that as these plans start being rolled out, the Biden administration does a better job about taking credit and talking about it to the communities that aren't as aware. So as one example, Trump's signature being on every $1,200 check was sent out. If Biden does something with, as is being rumored and talked about by Chuck Schumer, with removing debt for folks who have federal student loans, that needs to you need to get a letter saying, with a Biden signature saying, we did this. And that needs to be true for each piece of the Korean economy and each piece of the Build Back Better plan or any other part of the climate plan as well, where there needs to be a stamp on it saying, we are doing these 3 things. We're making it sustainable, we're building what the country needs, and we're growing the economy in a way that's sustainable for you. And it's going to be hard, but that message works. It polls really well. It works on an individual basis, and it hits kind of the key intersection points.
So at a glance, it sounds to me like you're saying we should plant more trees in order to use it. They've already dumb it all down into one sentence.
That's part of it. So we are seeing throughout Western civilization, if you look at Western Europe, if you look at North America, the collectivization of farming and the way that farms are being consolidated has meant that a lot of land that has formerly been used for agriculture is being abandoned. And part of that also has to do with the way we're overusing different fertilizers, nitrogen-based fertilizers, and the way it's damaging the soil. So that's a side conversation. But there is a lot of land that is potentially could be used for planting trees. And some of that can be farmland that can be turned into sustainably managed forests where they literally harvest these trees over and over every several years. And that's one of the great pieces of mass timber. It doesn't require extremely old trees. We definitely should be turning trees elsewhere. But I mean, we're not going to stop building. We just have to figure out ways to do it sustainably. And that's got to be a piece of it.
Cool.
And how much do you feel can realistically be accomplished in the next 4 years, both on the scenario in which there might be in a very obstructionist Senate, and both in a scenario where there is just enough support within Congress to pass all this legislation through that would enable these kinds of policies to grow?
So it's definitely a lot easier with a Senate, but I think it's pretty clear that at best, Joe Biden and his administration are going to have 50-50. And so I would expect a lot of stuff is done by executive order, and then you see it also, as different spending bills are passed, I think you see a push to have this kind of sustainable economic development and investment. So there's things that you can do legislatively, but it's definitely going to be minimized by the Senate. So I would expect to see major things happening by executive order. I think it's very clear we'll re-enter the Paris Climate Accords, and that's a step in the right direction. I think it's very clear that we'll see weatherization be committed to, and that's going to be retrofitting homes across the country with a particular emphasis on rural communities and rural communities of color to make sure that their homes are ready to deal with things like hurricanes, things like higher temperatures, and electrifying them so that they are more efficient. And you're also going to see that's going to be message around job creation, because the studies that have been done on that say, about 1 million jobs could be created by all these changes that are being made if they do actually weatherize 4 million homes as they're committed to. But beyond that, while things like federal transit investment, where they have talked about having investment for cities with 100,000 people or more, may be challenging with the Republican Senate, it's still doable. Infrastructure investment is one thing where there's possibilities. And there may be some opportunities to work with Republicans who want to see that investment in their own communities, because it looks good for them as well. But at the executive order level, there are still other things Biden could do. For example, one of the big things that's being talked about is whether or not Biden can use the federal powers to divest some funds for service members and offer a divestment option. Currently, there's not an option for service member pensions. that is divested from fossil fuels. And so that's something that may be able to be done by executive order. And I think also there's a lot of opportunities just by changing who's in the different agencies and finding good agency heads and staff members to really make a difference on that. So it would be a lot easier if Biden had 52-48 majority in the Senate. But without it, I think there's still work that can be accomplished.
Okay. If I could ask you about the Paris Climate Accords. So that's like it's a thing that people hear the words of, and we know that, oh yeah, all right, being a part of that is an international agreement to reduce, bad pollution, greenhouse gases most likely. But most people don't really know what's actually in it. And I'm gonna tell you, I'm one of them. I don't know what's in it.
Yeah.
But before I ask you about what's in it, I also want to ask you, how is the rest of the world doing in participating? Because one thing I remember reading this headline in 2009 and 2010, how we were literally the only nation, the singular only nation that actually met the requirements and benchmarks and measurements put forth in the climate accord. So I've heard basically just impressions down the grapevine that most of the world isn't really doing their part. So what is in the climate accords, actually?
Yeah.
And also, how the heck do we get the rest of the world to go on board with it? Because the United States, as important as we are, we're only 15% of global greenhouse emissions. We could go to zero. Every single American could drop dead tomorrow, and the world is still going to be careening on a course towards climate disaster. So, here's my questions. What do you got?
So, okay, a couple things. One, I think the first thing to understand is that we're going to have major climate disasters. We are already facing those. What the Paris Accords are really about is trying to make those less bad. So, I mean, if you look at the wildfires that covered the West Coast at the end of the summer and early fall, those, I mean, here in Seattle, we spent 2 weeks or so where you couldn't really go outside without having it be toxic to your health. And that happened in San Francisco, in Portland, all throughout California.
So if I could interject, I really don't think the wildfires is I think if you were going to put climate change as the thing to blame, I think that's more like the straw that broke the camel's back. There's a much stronger correlation to the decrease in logging in California, to the increase
combo,
and basically just the lack of forest management. 51% of the entire state is federal land. In addition to, sorry,
go ahead. I was just going to say, so forest management is definitely a huge part of it. But the conditions that are making this worse are not just forest management; it's also definitely climate. It's increasing the length of the fire season. It's making the brush that's left there much easier to burn because it's much more dry. There's less water that's actually in the area. So it's a bit of both, and I'm not going to make a statement that one is 100% or one is 50%, but they're definitely both to blame. And part of that is you've seen as fires have gotten worse over the last 20, 30 plus years, and part of that is because of how climate has adjusted and how we've continued to have worse and worse fire seasons because it is getting warmer and the conditions for these fires are getting worse. We are actually moving the federal budget for firefighting is significantly moving to firefighting versus forest management. And so that's part of the problem, is that it's costlier and costlier every year. So we do less and less forest management. And then as the climate continues to worsen, that just makes the problem worse and worse. So there's a huge problem there. And I do want to shout out my Washington State's Commissioner of Public Lands, Hillary Franz, who I think has a really great program that she's working on, where they're working to do forest management and have those trees, which can be thin, dead, sick, all those trees can be used for mass timber. So this is an example of where I think there's a win-win-win potentially, where it's we can help manage forests and try to make fires less bad. We can use those that lumber that's removed to then make mass timber, which is a sustainable building material, which can then help reinvigorate rural economies. Places like Spokane, Washington, there's major plants that are coming online elsewhere in Washington State and Oregon. There's in California. This is coming, and then that can then be used to build the new homes that are needed and consolidate things in urban growth. So I think there is potential there, and I think that's maybe my core message would be when it comes to whether we can solve on our own. we can't fully solve it, but what we can do is we can turbocharge the industry and the solutions that are going to solve these problems. We have ideas and we have technologies that are going to make a difference on this. And with major federal investment, we can accelerate rapidly their growth and their adoption. If we do that, we can then incentivize it elsewhere. As I think the American ethos is, we'll sell it elsewhere too. We'll spread it out. I mean, look at the pandemic plans, right? Like, so if we look at the pandemic plans that the Trump administration decided not to use for COVID-19, those were actually some stuff that was come up with during the Obama administration and was sent across the world. Everyone has those plans. Americans started writing those plans. A lot of American doctors wrote those plans, with input obviously from the rest of the world. And those plans were propagated elsewhere.
Bush, actually,
we should start that. You're right.
I read a book about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was Bush that was like, oh, shit, we're totally not prepared for a pandemic. But anyway, sorry, you can keep going.
Yeah, but I guess my point is, like, when we have ideas like this, America, because of our cultural influence, because of our wealth, because of our, frankly, capitalist desire from some folks to go sell stuff, we're going to go sell this. And so if we have an idea where we say, okay, like, this is a sustainable industry idea, it beats what's happening, we'll get excited about it. I mean, you can look at the investment that's happening in solar and wind, and the kind of the tipping point we're reaching where coal and gas are just not seeing as much investment. I think the tipping point is 2015, where now you're seeing more investment in solar and wind. We're going to see this continue in other industries and other technology opportunities. And those are ways that, we may not be able to solve the problem ourselves, but we can help grow those green industries. And if we do that, we'll have the economic benefits of having been on the forefront. We'll be able to propagate those throughout the rest of the world, and it would help solve the climate problem that we're facing. And to get back to the original question of what's in the Paris Climate Accords, I'm not going to quote numbers because I don't remember them well enough. This is why I always look things up. But essentially the idea is we're trying to keep warming to about 2 degrees Celsius or below, because there are different thresholds for how, and someone in the comments is, I'm sure, going to say it's 2.5 or something, and they're welcome to. But it's basically the different thresholds for warming as it gets worse, and it'll increase the disaster potential from things like hurricanes due to weather patterns, from wildfires because it accelerates negative forest management, and also just from various common effects, including water, where we're seeing issues around that already, with the Pentagon pointing to it as a potential reason that ISIS began is the lack and scarcity of water. So I think we're essentially in the Paris Climate Accords, we're trying to say, let's minimize the damage, because we've already done enough stuff that unless we stop things right now and change everything tomorrow, we're not going to fix the problem overnight. But we can start minimizing the damage. We can start building the industries that are going to take us to a greener future and a more sustainable future. And we can try to help people who are struggling with it right now.
And looping back on the Paris Climate Agreement, like one of my, I want to say, personal gripes with it is that, from my understanding, from what I researched at least, there's no real binding enforcement of the goals set. It's kind of like, hey, all these nations, we got together and say we're going to do this and we're going to help improve the world. But when Trump signaled and officially left the Paris Climate Agreement, he technically kind of left something that had no penalty for not agreeing to it anyways. So would you feel like there should be a binding mechanism to something like the Paris Climate Agreement?
So I think this is my overall concern with most international agreements like this is often the penalties aren't very high and the ties that bind are very voluntary. And so that works when everyone is kind of on the same page, and that works when people are willing to go penalize others for it. Right? In the case of let's say Geneva Convention stuff. But even if you look at that, a lot of the times other countries don't want to really intervene. They may say, "Oh, we'll sanction you," but is that a real issue? So I definitely agree that there needs to be improvement around what we should be doing as far as penalties for the Paris Climate Accords. Though I think we'll probably see over the next 10 years, I think you're going to see another large international movement to address that and adjust that. I think there's going to be the necessity as disasters worsen, as people realize the issues we're having.
Yeah, and the matters are only getting worse. Like, with everything going on in 2020, like, people aren't kind of realizing the fact that, like, for the second time in history, we're going into the Greek alphabet for naming storms. And this is by far the most active hurricane I think we're at the letter T or something in the Greek alphabet. And, it's kind of unfortunate that, with everything going on, it's not really talked about. Like, hey, we have, of course, the pandemic is nothing to be taken lightly, of course, but we're kind of 2020 has been definitely a year where people kind of get complacent with all the wrong things happening and they don't really think much about it because it's a new normal, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, I mean, 2020, like hell, I barely remember the start of the year, but in the start of the year we had massive wildfires in Australia. We've had a huge hurricane season. Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of stuff going on, and the pandemic has kind of covered that up in some ways, where it's just like it's taken so much oxygen out of the room that a lot of the other things we're facing, it's been challenging for us to address. And I think your point about the hurricanes is really valid. We have major concerns about that because as those storms worsen, places like Florida are not far over sea level. That is a flat state. As sea levels rise, as storms get worse and worse, there's going to be a lot of damage. There's going to be a lot of lives lost, and it is just it's a huge issue that we're going to have to face in the coming years. No question.
Yeah, for sure. I think that a lot of conservatives would get a lot more on board with this if you were to just point out, like, hey, so we're humanity. We're going to survive, all right? Like, people, like, the leftist characterization is that the world is going to end, all right? And, like, conservatives are immediately going to reject that, all right? Mm-hmm. So, basically, like, be honest with them. It's like, yeah, we're humanity. We're going to survive, all right?
Yes.
But look at how much it's going to cost us. Like,
capital and buildings, everything,
right,
yeah.
Right. It is going to do this much damage and cost you this much money. Or we could try to make it not as bad.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. And that's why I try to talk about this from an economic perspective, where it's like, okay, look, the lives lost, horrible. The fact that we're going to have, potentially wars over water in some places, worsening refugee crises as other countries have major droughts, that's a massive concern. But I think people up on the left, we get stuck in this idea of, like we have such empathy for these people, how we have to talk about their stories. And it really ignores the way to reach other folks, where it's a way of saying, let's reach other people on the left by using empathy and these personal stories of these, distraught immigrants who've been pushed out of their homes by drought and all of these horrible disasters. But that's not necessarily effective messaging. And I think that's a failing of folks on the left in general, is while the policies are good and they can build support in some ways very strongly, the all-up messaging can sometimes be too targeted towards one side or another instead of trying to give broader support. If we talk more about what this can do to help the economy, to what this can do to try to reverse the damage we're seeing, I think that's a message that wins with a lot of independents and a lot of conservatives too, who want to get their logging job back. And that doesn't mean you need to ignore the intersectional nature of things either. Because I know a lot of folks on the left will say, "Oh, well, we need to make sure we're talking about people of color first and ensuring we're addressing them." Like that doesn't have to ignore that. Like the weatherization program I talked about earlier. The Biden climate plan includes a plan to weatherize 4 million buildings across the United States. That plan is targeted at people of color in rural areas. It's explicitly mentioned in it. And it would create potentially up to 1 million jobs in manufacturing and in actually doing the weatherization retrofits. So that's something where it's like you have this clear intersection with climate justice and trying to help people of color and pushing for equal solutions, but also has a massive potential economic impact. And the left, for some reason, likes to get distracted from that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and like when you were talking about go ahead, Jason.
I have a question about what you mentioned sustainable timber and everything like that. What is the way to sell that in an area that is so attached to natural gas and oil? Like I've been working for Kinder Horn here recently and throughout Oklahoma, and she's brought up sustainable timber and everything as a way to replace the oil and natural gas jobs that are leaving because of the higher taxes on oil and natural gas, of course, and everything currently. But no one here wants sustainable timber, despite the thousands of acres of dead farmland that there is that's not currently being used and all that other stuff. It seems like the conservatives don't want to bring timber into Oklahoma, even though it could like replace the natural gas and oil industry here and all those jobs. Like, how do you sell that, like, to people who are just natural gas jobs?
I wish I had a silver bullet to say, "Oh, this is the way it's going to fix it." I don't. But what you can do is you keep having those conversations, and you. I think it really comes down to not just messaging. Like it's great if I write an op-ed saying this and they see it in the local paper, but they may ignore that. But we need to have people on the ground who are in those communities who are building support for it. We need to have their local city councils being aware of it. You need to have a lobbying group that's talking to them about, we could do this in your community. We can do this, help this way. Because the first reaction folks are going to have to, seeing their jobs going away because of how the economy is changing, it is usually fear and anger, right? And so right now we're dealing with that fear and anger, and we need to move past that to say, okay, let's find some solutions. But before you can do that, you have to accept that anger and kind of have a real conversation with them. We're not going to just magically fix that. It's going to take a lot of really hard conversations. It's going to take adjusting the messaging around it to talk more about the economic benefits and how that can help. And I think you also have to talk about the fact that there's a point where we have to try to figure out how to say, like, these jobs are not coming back. I think for me, my thought on that would be that, look, wind and solar have just become so cheap that oil and natural gas are no longer as lucrative. And so it doesn't make sense from an economic perspective. So I think maybe that's some of the messaging, but I don't have a silver bullet for that.
Yeah, one of the things I recall, especially in Iowa, like a very effective way to speak to especially people, Republican voters and Trump supporters, is just downright agreeing with them and agreeing what they support. Like, I recall being in a very rural, very red town one day, and I knew I was a fish out of water. And my method was straight up like go against everything that I've been taught and instructed. I would knock on a door and tell them, "Yo, Trump 2020," and looking at me, a minority, they'd be taken aback and be like, "Yeah," I'd be like, "Yo, so check this out. Trump's done a great job in the economy. GDP is up, unemployment's down. How can we improve upon that?" And by initiating the dialogue in a way that's very receptive to things that in their worldview they agree with, they're much more open to have a dialogue with you in general. And just speaking into the greater political conversation in our country right now, one of my biggest gripes is that, especially a lot of people on the left, from what I've experienced, tend to think that turning away voters they disagree with is a winning strategy.
And it's not.
It's not. Like, there's, of course, a huge civil war internally going on in the left right now. And they think that, let's look at a scenario where there's 100% voter turnout in an election, and everyone's hard line with their parties, and it's like a 60-40 Republicans to Democrats. Like, how are you mathematically going to win if you don't extend an olive branch and try to have a dialogue with these people or with your fellow voters in general? Yeah. And, there was a point I wanted to bring up earlier, but yeah, I was, just touching upon the greater conversation of things. Like, there are ways to have these kinds of conversations. And for some reason, like, the way I view it, it's just mathematically, like, when we have a bigger opportunity to grow, sure, I would like to talk to left-leaning voters that usually agree more with what I see. But given the partisan nature of our country, we know the majority of people are going to vote by party lines.
You have to vote,
good majority of the time. So what does that tell us? Yeah. That tells us that the biggest room for growth right now is not where we are on the side of the aisle right now, but it's on the completely other side.
Yeah, completely.
So I think that's a really challenging thing from a resource perspective. And to be clear, I don't disagree with you that we should be having those conversations, that we shouldn't be leaving those folks behind, because that's part of the problem, right? Is a lot of folks who are in rural communities, a lot of folks who don't identify with, a university school or SNL or coastal elites, as they think about it, they feel left behind. They feel like the country has changed underneath them, and their way of life is kind of ignored. And so we cannot ignore that. We have to speak to those people rationally, and we have to speak to those people in a way that understands their pain and accepts it and says, we don't hate you. And I know there are a lot of folks who don't have that energy right now, who just don't have, say, I don't have the time to put into this, and that's understandable. Because, we are resource starved when it comes down to it. Like, we can't have a conversation with every person in this country without a massive investment of resources. So I think the challenge, I think, is a lot of campaigns are making decisions very much in the moment and saying, I have to win my election. Can I more efficiently get out, these infrequent voters, or can I convince these folks? And I think that's part of the problem the Democratic Party in particular has, where it has become very focused on the electoral now of, how do I win this election? And there needs to be more thought about long-term organizing and more thought about long-term building. And I think in a large part that kind of, where we'll see eventual gains with the folks you're talking about is with that kind of long-term organizing. It's usually not like a one-time conversation. And that's also, frankly, true of folks, when they're trying to bring left folks into voting regularly and to be engaged. This is an ongoing conversation. And there's a lot of research showing that says, deep canvassing, long-term organizing, that works. And I think that's where we can see a big difference, hopefully, is if we can continue to grow those movements locally in all our communities, but also expand them across the country. I think that's where there's opportunity. So, I think I'm actually really encouraged by stuff like the Georgia runoff, for example. And I'm hopeful that there's going to be a lot of important conversations and grassroots organizing and building that happens out of that.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point when you mention like the electoral now, because people's mental capacity can't see past the next few months or years.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways, like the whole electoral now thing, hoping to win this election right now, isn't taking into account the effects that will have down the road in future elections and partisanship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that.
Well, I think there's like this divide of like who you extend that olive branch to, because there are people that you just can't reach, and it's more efficient to just, in order to save their lives, you have to like leave them behind a little bit, and then fix the world's burning, and you have to put out the fire now.
Yeah.
So you can't always rally everyone, because there are some people like, I don't want to loan my bucket to the fire or something because it might not come back.
And to me, I think that's like the QAnon.
If that makes any sense at all. Sorry.
No, I agree with you. I think it's you do have finite resources. You can't talk to everyone. And to me, there are buckets where you just like the QAnon folks, you're not going to convince them. You need to let them figure it out for themselves. You need to let them see it for themselves. But they are so into their media hole that's their world. You're not going to talk them out of it. Even some of their friends and family often can't talk them out of it. So you definitely have to make those decisions. But I think
I love it and I agree with it. But the fact that we tried to humanize racism with it and everything, and say, well, you have to accept racism because it's just who they are, humanity first. And I'm like, no, you can fix racism. You can have the conversation. You can tell them what they're saying is wrong, and you can explain to them why it's wrong, and you can try to bring them around. You can't just accept racism as a necessary evil to because it's humanity first. It's not humanity first to racism. It's humanity first to fight against it and to try to bring them over to the right side. And that's what I see a lot with the blanket of, you accept everyone, humanity first. And, that's one of my core issues with it currently. See people, trying to say, well, humanity first, you just accept racists. And I'm like, no, that's not humanity first to accept racism, in my opinion,
Yeah,
we can change the world for the better. Humanity first is about.
I think any large political movement that you want to have, including climate change, I think it's going to be a loser if you're focusing on racism, because just common sense at a glance, not the depth, but at a glance, which is what most people will give you, is that climate change and racism have nothing to do with each other. Now, you can make a statistical argument that they indirectly influence each other, all right? But like that's indirect, it's not direct. And again, that common sense,
front of the deep canvassing that he was talking about,
Well, still, I'm speaking in general terms, right? Like it's an important part of gaining any motivation and political will is how you message. And if you're messaging that climate change is a racist issue, I'm just saying, it's kind of a losing marketing strategy.
I don't think he was talking about climate change.
I was just talking about the conversation of his deep, and how we were focused on winning the electorate now versus, building for the future. Like climate change wasn't in that part of the conversation. Sorry.
Okay.
I wasn't trying to.
I'm having to piece together what you say because maybe it's just me, but I'm really not able to hear you well. So I think
it is a little hard.
Yeah. Okay. I might have plugged in some.
Well, I will say, Pierce, on the kind of topic of like racism and climate change, like there's definitely a clear intersection, but you're right that that's not winning messaging with most of the country. That's right. We should be talking, economic kitchen table stuff with them, saying, we can grow the economy, we can help you, get new jobs, we can help, revitalize your communities, we can make your home more safe and secure from disaster, and you can leverage the money that you're spending, and you can leverage the conversations you're having to address that racism that's inherent in what's happening. But to lead with that doesn't work for the folks you're trying to convince. Like that may work in some communities, but even in a lot of, liberal bastions in progressive cities, people kind of go, huh? Like, wait, what do you mean? Racism and climate change? Those are different issues. So like we can have educational conversations and we should have organizing conversations around that. But when it comes to national messaging, when it comes to even regional messaging, that's not a winning way to go about it. No, you should definitely not be doing that. I agree.
Yeah. And I think like if we did want to talk about the racism aspect, racism is a very politically and charged word, if you will, but I guess a racial, I would like to use a racial aspect, if you will, is how like those water shortages that you messaged, is particularly in the Middle East, but far from only in the Middle East, like that's going to hit more and more people because like having enough water, at least for daily living, to a large extent is a binary issue. It's either you have it or you don't, right? Yeah. And like you can say you might have enough water for up to 100 million people, but once you get to 101 million people, now suddenly like nobody has enough water.
Yeah.
And that's how these things often work. The United States, we're fairly insulated from it because, I mean, our geography is pretty top tier in this regard. But also, like, even if we don't have the rains, then we have the aquifers or we have the lakes. And even so often, a lot of our water usage is discretionary. We have, like, lawns. Well, I don't need to water the lawn. California... Right. Yeah, I'm sure you do. You don't need to water the lawn. So like that also gives us a buffer, though, of, like, our normal usage and, like, with all the discretionary usage. Yeah. A lot of places don't have as much discretionary usage, like they already might not be taking showers in the first place. They're culturally might be doing something else. So like, okay, well, there's a huge source of water that they don't have the option of cutting out because it was never there to begin with. They don't have lawns to water and then to not cut water to save water on. Like, it's just a simple like, yeah, we're already using like as little water as we can, and now we don't have it. We're screwed. And when that happens, like people fight. Like people don't just roll over and die. Generally speaking, people fight. Actually,
the reason. Sorry, go ahead. Part of the reason we're seeing this refugee influx too of folks trying to come here is like we have water. We have these resources. We're going to be insulated from these effects of climate change. Beyond the disaster increase and some other things for longer than many places are. Totally agree.
Right. Yeah. A little bit of
the water shelf that was almost out of water at some point.
What was that, Jason? You're talking about an area that's almost out of water, but your audio keeps on cutting off a little bit, unfortunately. But I think you might be talking about, I believe it was an African country that was nearing a day zero event.
Like South Africa, the water shelf. They run out of water at a certain point. And so what they did is they started conserving, and that somehow it just started going up. And now they're like, have a good supply.
Exactly. Yeah, there was a day zero water crisis essentially in a South African country. I don't recall which one off the top of my head, but from my understanding of it at the time, like it was basically presented to the people like, hey, this is a hard deadline. We are at the verge of running out of water. Like it was unfortunate that it took an upcoming catastrophe with like the knowledge that this is going to happen soon for the community to react in a sense like, oh God, now it's going to get bad, that we're going to get affected immediately by it. So then they started reactionarily like preparing for it instead of proactively being for that. And that's, that's a big, in general, that's a big problem with the world, in my opinion. Like, yes. I recall this conversation when we talked about healthcare some time ago, Pierce, how he talked about like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Like, we were talking earlier, like how, yeah, we're going to survive, but how much is it going to cost? At what cost? And, we shouldn't be waiting for the fire to get to a level that it's unsustainable before we started calling the fire department and throwing water at it.
And I think that really comes back to a piece of human nature too, which is it's really easy for us to see in the now of, oh, if I, fall down those stairs, I'll hurt myself. But it's harder to see that if you continue to work out on a regular basis and build muscle mass, you're less likely to fall when you're in your old age. We're really good at making analysis of like in the moment or like short term, but the longer term analysis is more challenging for us. And I think that's where we kind of have the issues with, to your point of like the ounce of prevention versus pound of cure, is we as humans, our brains just don't work that way as effectively. We're not as likely to lean into that. And so it's a huge issue that we really need to work to confront. Totally agree.
Yeah, and I think that ties into also the rate of change in our society. Like
Yes.
People born every single day moving forward, the exponential rate of change you're going to see in our society is going to be just greater and greater. Like I was born in 91, my sisters were born in 2001, and those are two completely different worlds. But if you compare a 10-year difference 100 years ago, they're almost, by and large, born into the same society. And in their understanding 100 years ago, they see the future as kind of like this constant thing they're going to work for to improve. Where in this case, we have 10 years ago, and kind of like smartphones were just coming out of the verge of being a new thing. Now it's a standard thing. And then the I generation is going to be expecting a change and a betterment of society, so to speak, in which their everyday, in my opinion, very blindsided lives are interacting with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the kind of technological rate of change that we're seeing in society is just completely altering how the world is going to work in the future. And it's hard for us to even fully be aware of it and fully to comprehend how fast things are changing. And it's going to continue to accelerate.
Yeah. Collectively, we basically have the doomsayers and the wizards, where the doomsayers are like, technology is going to ruin the world. And then wizards are like, no, technology is actually going to save us. And over the course of human history, because this is not the first time where, humans have been like, hey, we're discovering new things. We've been on a constant streak of that since like the 1500s, right? With Luddites going far back as being like, hey, new technology bad, right? So this isn't a new concept, but the rate of increase is increasing. But anyway, so far the historical trend has been, it's worked out. The world didn't used to be able to support 7 billion people. Now it can, right? So, a statement that is true today might not be true tomorrow, sort of thinking in regards to technology. Is this trend going to continue? I don't know, because it's definitely ramping up faster than it has in the past. But so far in the past, the wizards in the two arguments, the wizards versus the doomsayers, the wizards have been on the right side. So I guess that gives us a little bit of reason to be optimism. One tech we have, such as for like water storage, and Jason actually asked me to bring this up over the chat, is desalinization. So like there's a lot of water in the ocean, right? Problem is we can't do much with it. But desalinization gives us the opportunity, but that costs a lot of energy, right?
Yeah.
But hey, if we're able to produce cheap, clean, efficient energy, well, then hopefully we also have water. I don't know. Like, Connor, what are your perspectives on desalinization? Is that like a thing that we should be pursuing, or is that just like a feel goods, not actually economical thing?
So for the moment, I think it would be the latter. It's not currently viable most places, but I think there is potential for it in the future. And I think this is where a lot of the techs that we're looking at now that may not be fixing things in the short term, but are really interesting ideas. As they get more efficient or as other things scale, there may be opportunities. So as an example, from a scaling perspective, we're seeing clean energy and the production of clean energy scale really, really fast. We're seeing solar get incredibly cheap. We're seeing wind get incredibly cheap. We're seeing geothermal take off in some areas. People are talking about nuclear and trying to invest in that. So there are some definite opportunities where desalinization would make sense. I am not a desalinization expert, but I would say right now it doesn't make sense for most communities. As we move forward, that calculus may change really rapidly.
All right. Makes sense to me. So a bit of a topic change, if you guys are with it. I don't know if you guys have paid attention to Ethiopia lately, But Ethiopia, so there were 100 million people. I think it's like 110 million or something like that. But in the last few days, like a potential civil war has started to break out. So basically, due to COVID, the president or prime minister had said, like, no more elections. And you can...
That would work well, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. So the northern part of the country, which, by the way, overthrew like the previous autocratic ruler. I think dictator is too strong a word to use, but I'll use autocratic ruler. Overthrew the previous autocratic ruler. The northern part of the country basically decided, well, no, we're going to have elections anyway. So naturally, since they're the only ones that had elections, they elected someone that's different from the current president. So the current president decided to send in the military to forcibly reintegrate the northern region that has been largely autonomous. And a lot of geopolitical thinkers are like naturally worried about this because, I mean, Ethiopia is the bellwether for the region, and like that whole region, I'm going to list some names for people that might not be familiar with the region. Borders include Eritrea and South Sudan and Somalia. All right, like these are not nations known for exactly having stable governments right now. So naturally, any instability in what is pretty much the most stable like bellwether in the region, this spells really, really, really bad, not just for Ethiopia, but also for its neighbors. And generally speaking, in this sorts of situations, when a fairly high populous area like this loses functioning government, famine and like water shortages and whatnot follow, as well as a whole lot of environmentally unfriendly things, because like suddenly if the gas is no longer coming through your pipes, suddenly you're burning wood from the tree, which is less environmentally friendly, right? You chop down the tree and burn the wood if you need the heat. Now Ethiopia, they're not exactly getting freezing winters, but I'm just giving you an example because it's not the only
well,
thing,
you
right?
see reverberations, to your point, to other countries too, where you see refugees in that country fleeing elsewhere and putting a resources strain on Somalia or Eritrea or elsewhere. Yeah, I think it's a real concern. Yeah,
for sure. So I don't know. I guess I don't really have much of a question if you guys aren't read up on it. But like I
didn't know about that. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean, most people don't. In the United States, you generally only hear news that we have like a cultural attachment to. So you're not going to hear news about Ethiopia because unless you're in like DC, there is not really a sizable Ethiopian population in the United States. Heck, even
like a decent one, if I remember correctly, right?
What was that, Jason?
Say again?
Oh, Storm Lake had a decent Ethiopian population, or was that another African country?
Oh, Storm Lake. I do recall there being just a multicultural presence in general.
Yeah.
There was a conversation Pierce and I had with a store owner. I don't recall off the top of my head from which nation he was from, but I believe it was an African nation.
I think he was from Ethiopia, actually. Yeah.
And he was a doctor too. Like, I wonder how he's doing. I hope he's doing well. He was a stand-up guy.
Yeah, he was a cool guy. I do hope he's doing well. He had big plans, and if anybody had the personality to do it, I think he is for sure. Immigrants make our nation so much stronger. We really should try to attract the best and brightest.
And one final change of topic, if you don't mind, because I've been wanting to poke your brain about this, Pierce, and I'm sure we're probably in agreement here. But what are your thoughts with Joe Biden not receiving the presidential daily briefings?
I haven't heard of this. What are you talking about?
So traditionally, I don't know if it's
by law, you mean in transition? Yeah. I know what you mean. So I can't exactly sound surprised, right? All right. So fun fact. I've been part of the presidential daily briefing before. So
no shit.
Yeah. So I guess I have a little more insight than the average person on this. Yeah. So it's unfortunate. But also more unfortunate is that Trump really hasn't. How do I put this? My understanding by people in the community that I'm still in touch with is that Trump has warped the presidential daily briefing in its entirety in the first place. Basically, his briefers realized that he doesn't care about a grand majority of topics. So in order to get him to care about something, they'd have to frame it a certain way. And oftentimes that means like padding it with some other, thing to like stroke his ego. Yeah, and this sounds really jaded. I'm just relaying the message as I've heard it. And it's unfortunate, but I don't think that Biden is likely missing out on an overwhelming lot. Without a doubt, there is, classified and privileged information that he is missing out on that he's going to have to get ramped up to speed when he does take office. But as far as the transitions go, that is fairly low on my list of concerns. I'm not going to lie to you. And actually, I don't know how much longer you want to hang around, Connor, but we could probably talk for a while on the transition. So we just had the election. President Biden is now officially the president-elect, according to the Associated Press, who are, basically the end-all, be-all of yes, you are the president-elect or not. Georgia's going to have a recount automatically. This isn't like any malicious trick. It's in Georgia's state laws to be if you're within 0.5% of the opponent, you have a recount, right? This is fine.
And it's enough of a margin, though. It's so unlikely we're going to see anything change there, I think.
Yeah. And honestly, at this point, even if Georgia does flip, Biden still has the electoral threshold to win anyway, assuming that none of the other states change. Which at the moment, Trump's lawsuits don't seem to be going as well for him. So momentum seems to be that Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. All right, so transition, like what is happening now? Because Donald Trump is still the president for the next, almost 60 days, right? What the heck is going on? I'll tell you, some people have messaged me and telling me that they're worried that he's going to be like burning everything down as he's leaving. We saw recently that he just fired Defense Secretary Mark Esper, along with a few other, higher position heads. My own personal thoughts, like I think that he is losing control, and every narcissist is afraid of losing control. So he's going to act out in ways that make him still feel like he has a sense of control pretty much as often as I think he can. And a classic way to do that is firing someone. You definitely feel like you're in charge if you're firing someone. So I don't know, what do you guys think? I don't want to be like too negative, but like what are your guys' fears as well as optimisms in regarding to the transition?
Well, yeah, him canning SecDef was definitely something I wanted to ask you about, but you always seem to have a grounded perspective on realistic outcomes, I would feel, and always brings me a little calm into to my not immediate alarmist nature, but my cautious view on like how things are going, because I have I would say a fair understanding of our chain of command. And when I saw him can Mark Esper, like even though I kind of saw that coming from his already established resignation letter he had penned down already. Right. Like, it's a transition. Like I tell people this, like for me, I understand Joe Biden seems to have clinched 270. Like I'll wait for the states to verify just for more assurance. But for me, it's not over till he takes the oath of office and there's a safe transition of power. That's like my end all be all of like, okay, we're good. But, given the kind of person who Trump is, I cautiously don't put anything out of the realm of possibility. Him conceding publicly for me is up in the air. I can easily see him either doing it or not doing it. But him making a shakeup in the Pentagon is of at least notable concern to me, and it is newsworthy given it is a lame duck session, and like he knows he kind of, I think every day is seeing more and more the writing on the wall that he's out the door. And then my only concern is to what extent he's going to try to remain in control as a narcissist.
I gotta say, I think I would be surprised if he does concede. It seems like there's really little incentive for him, as to your point, both of you, a narcissist, for him to admit defeat. He can rabble rouse and try to turn, GOP voters, which polls are going quite well, against the elections. There is a slim but potentially real possibility that that could lead to a bloodless coup of some sort or a flip of the election. And that's something that people are realistically concerned about. The more likely scenario, though, is probably going to be something where it's, I think, like you said, Paris, he is making it really hard for Biden to come in day one and hit the ground running. Like I know he wants to, because like the briefing, may not be as big of a concern yet as far as missing out on some of that classified intelligence, but the lack of access to transition funds to set up his staff members to for recruitment, to do all the checks they need to do. That's going to be a logistical nightmare. And so the longer that goes on, the more frustrated I am with that. And then I think the third piece is that, like I said, there's really little incentive for Trump to concede, to admit anything. The GOP is standing behind him for now. Folks are afraid of alienating his base and the infrequent, Republican-leaning voters that he turned out. And if he continues to push this narrative of, I was robbed, worst case, he can use this to leverage it for a great book deal and, more rallies and more money-making opportunities as he leaves office. So I see very little incentive for him not to continue to stick with what I think his instinct is, which is to say, oh, this is ridiculous. I mean, you can look back at he tweeted this and talked about this back in 2016 when he lost the Iowa caucus to Ted Cruz, and he was like, oh, it was rigged, the election fraud. He never admits, something was wrong. He never apologizes. I would be quite surprised if he conceded, frankly.
Yeah. And going on to sure. What's in it for him? You got to think about worst case scenario, he makes Joe Biden's transition a nightmare day one. That can go along with his messaging to his base that he knows is only going to listen to him. Hey, see how much of an ineffective president this is. You can't even get this done the first 100 days. We're not going to listen to Joe Biden and you saying that he's not making the transition easy for him. And, one of the more unfortunate things that shows the partisan, unfortunate nature of this country is that apparently a lot of GOP leadership, both in the Senate and the House, have to congratulate Joe Biden privately about his electoral win. And, I guess that just shows you how, in fear of speaking out for the writing on the wall they are. I'm he, by the day, Biden's lead is increasing in these close states. But the fact that, you can't congratulate someone on a fair win publicly, I think says a lot.
Yeah. I'm not a Democrat.
I've got my...
I'm not a Democrat. But I was extraordinarily disappointed with the Republican Party when the impeachment hearings were being held, and only Romney had the guts to actually say, I think there's enough reason to go to trial. It's not even you're guilty, It was just enough to even go to trial. The Republican senators just in lockstep went and said, we're not even going to go to trial. At that point, I'm basically thinking all of you need to go. And I hate to be a single issue at that, but as someone who thinks that your political opinions come secondary to your sense of patriotic duty, I believe that you failed the litmus test of my higher important issue, and I think that you all got to go. Except for Romney. I think Romney's great. And I would have loved the Romney presidency in 2016 as well. I'm sorry, 2012, I meant to say. I would have loved the Romney presidency. I think he would have been great. But we wouldn't have even had Trump too. But
it's the lack of moral and ethics. I agree, Pierce, where it's this unwillingness to stand on moral principles and to stand up to folks that they know are wrong. And it's very disappointing, and it's a huge concern for the country. So I wrote a short article back in January when the impeachment trial was going on, because I was looking at the coverage on different stations and saying, it is wild how different this is. And I think part of the problem is the way the media has fractured. Social media obviously has been a huge part of that. The internet's been a huge part of that. But I mean, even conservative talk radio going back, 40 years, and the death of the fairness doctrine. There is a huge while you're seeing major companies are destroying the silos that keep their teams separate so people can collaborate. They're talking about being digitally agile and and digital transformation, cross-functional teamwork. You're seeing the exact opposite in American politics, where we are continuing to move farther apart. And a big part of that is the messaging and the media that we're all hearing, and that's one of the number one problems we have to fix. It's got to be on the top of the list.
So, quick meta comment, Gianmarco, Jason, Rob. Have you noticed how this comes up literally every single episode?
That's a common
what
thread.
I'm laughing over here. Like this actually comes up every single episode.
Got about to see our gas, y'all.
I think it's a big problem, guys.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's an elephant in the room that no one really wants to talk about, and
Yeah.
it's just unfortunate. Like, you have to remove your ego as much as possible. You have to remember that you're there to represent. I mean, I personally feel that for representatives like senators and members of Congress, there has to be a balancing act between, yes, you are representing the will of your constituents, but you also have to remember that they are more than anything trusting your judgment. And your judgment should always come into play with what is, what is best for the country, what is the morally right thing to do. Yeah. And, it's very clear as day, especially nowadays, to see people, especially running for re-election, to see when they say something that is in their personal best interest, it's first and foremost hard for me to take them seriously just because of that. If they say something that, in the case of Romney, for example, speaking in support of impeachment because it is a fair thing, my views of Romney aside, I respect that because I know that is something that isn't in his personal best interest as someone that might be running for re-election or heard him publicly. You have to develop a thick skin to be in office. I think we all know that. And sometimes that thick skin comes into play when you have to stand your ground for what you feel strongly with conviction.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think we need more leaders and less politicians, frankly.
Yeah. There's another one for the Twitter, right?
Yeah.
We need more leaders and less politicians.
Yeah, I'm gonna tweet this episode later with that quote.
More young people in Congress. Younger people in Congress, I think, is a phenomenal first step. And I would obviously support someone that's older and shares, good wisdom and by a lot of practical measures understands the nature of what's going on in our country. But going back to my point about, understanding the rate of change in our society, the only people that are going to understand that best is people that are born into that change.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I'll never forget looking at that congressional hearing where they're grilling the CEO of the chief executive officer of Google, asking him how this thing is, spying on me, and him simply replying, "Well, that's an iPhone, sir. We don't make that, so I can't answer that question." It's just
it's embarrassing how out of touch Congress is with so many things that are happening in this country.
Yeah. Big changes need to be made. Definitely.
Yeah.
No,
the
senator here in Oklahoma, Jim Einhoff, one of them, he ran for re-election this year, and it came out that he knew what an email was, but he had never once received one or read one in his entire life.
Oh my God.
I mean, I wish that was true for me. Good for him, frankly.
He's 90. He's literally 90. He's the oldest person in the Senate by 10 years. It's
the age of the Senate is incredibly insane to me. And what's the average age there? It's over 70, isn't it? I want to say it's 73.
Yeah. Pelosi is Speaker of the House and she's 80. Dianne Feinstein's 87 years old.
Yeah.
And guys, we need term limits.
Average age of the Senate is 62.
Goodness.
Okay.
So you're looking at someone
still incredibly old. Yeah.
Yeah, you're looking at someone that was born in the 60s, before we landed on the moon.
Yeah. That puts it in perspective to me. The moon landed.
Oh gosh.
Did we really land on the moon, guys? Come on. Have you guys not been on Facebook lately? We've never been to the moon.
Right. My bad.
My bad. This flat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's another concern for me. People we'll make it to Mars, we'll make it to the moon, and I'm used to worrying about space debris and our capacity to even make it out of the planet in a few decades.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've read about that. Like, what if one satellite crashes into another, turns into a bunch of debris that then crashes into more satellites, that turns into more debris, and then we end up creating like a big giant web that we can't escape.
Exactly. People underestimate like the problem even like a loose screw in Earth orbit can cause to anything.
Oh yeah.
So, you're talking about the vacuum of space going God knows how long.
And
how fast.
that is why we don't use the pencil. All right, there's a joke about the NASA wasting $1 million on research to how to make a pen run in gravity or whatever. And it was like, yeah, the Russians just use a pencil. Well, you know what? The reason why we didn't use the pencil, we thought about it, is because we did use the pencil, and it turned out that graphite got stuck in the air. And we didn't want that pollutant because that pollutant was flammable and broke stuff.
It is a great joke, though, let's just say.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind me pulling us further afield for a minute, in the context of space debris and also kind of the broader like issues that we're having as a planet right now, do you guys think we're going to make it past? Well, I guess I should ask also. Are you familiar with the Fermi paradox of?
Yes, I had a feeling you were going with that.
Good. Yeah. So, do you think are we about to hit the great filter? Is our civilization going to go back down here? I'm kind of curious what you guys think about that.
Going back to our earlier conversation about the rate of change, every single day I feel my feeling more and more grows that lack of understanding, I should say, of our rate of change with our elected officials that allows for the great filter to present itself.
Yeah.
This is in a lot of ways a challenge of our time. And going back to what we were saying earlier, people don't have the mental capacity to think 10, 20, 30 years down the road from now, like they did previously. Like, think of ancient Egypt. Like, they are thinking about these, solar events that happen once every 1,000 years or something like that. And they would just, like, in all the ways as a community, work through that. And, this is more of an aside. I understand and appreciate the various great things about American capitalistic nature. But I think 2020, through an extension COVID itself, has really stretched American individualism to its, its thinnest extent right now.
Yeah.
And, go ahead.
I was just saying, I think part of the issue to kind of get back to what you're saying about Egypt and like thinking and on a longer scale is we are just bombarded by so much information today. I was kind of joking when I said this, but it would be great if I never had to read another email again. If I could manage to make that happen somehow. There's so much information coming at us. And we have a lot of research that shows that as a culture, the time period in which we focus on issues is getting shorter and shorter. So there's plenty of good research that shows like trending topics on Twitter, they're getting shorter. The time periods that things stay in the headlines, it's getting shorter because there's just so much information we're being bombarded with. There's always more content. There's always more things. And I think that is contributing to this problem that's already a human issue of how do we focus on long term? How do we think about everything that's going on? When I'm getting, Twitter notifications and, I've got someone in the other room talking and I've got emails coming in, and I've got, a book sitting over there. It's not conducive to this kind of long thought and this introspection. And our whole society is, running this way where we have, on-demand streaming content at all times, whether we want it or not sometimes.
Yeah, and to loop back to the segue as a primer for those that might not be aware. So what is the Fermi paradox? I think the best way to describe it to people is that there's something called, I think, the galactic calendar, I believe it is. So think of like the beginning of time, the Big Bang, as being January 1st in a calendar. And think of where we are now in human history as being December 31st. And I think the number is like all of known written human history in general has taken place in the last minute of the last hour of December 31st. And if you think of it that way, our society came about in a very, very, very microscopic fraction of time compared to the grander scale of the history of the universe. So if such a thing is true, how is there a possibility that another societies have existed previously in the grand scale that we have? And if that's the case, why haven't we heard of them? Where are all these people? If we got this far in a second of galactic time, imagine how we can get there how we can get in a minute, yes, which is in the galactic scale a huge amount of time. And what the Fermi paradox is that there is understandable concern that there is somewhere past societal evolution that a species cannot get through. For example, we don't know what that is, but it could be that it could be that advanced civilizations could always be self-destructive in nature, and they are their own demise. It could be the fact that there are forces beyond that control that we have yet to experience as a society that will stop us from advancing further. And that's not even getting into the fact that, but going back to a galactic scale, eventually space-time will get to a point that it is unfeasible and impossible, even with advancement technology, to get to other star systems because of the ever-expanding nature of the universe. So going back to what we were talking about, the question is like, what are we at the Fermi paradox? Are we at that great filter where we might not be able to get past? Are we going to be the first ones that get past it? Like, a lot of theorists just think of this as a way to like explain like, why haven't we seen other people? Or maybe it could be the fact that there are other people and they fly by Earth and see a very comparatively primitive species, much in the same way that we see an ant pile on the side of the road.
Yeah. I think that's the.
Have you guys ever seen the original?
The original
Men in Black. Have you guys ever
Yeah.
seen the original Men in Black? Okay, you remember the end of it where there's like a giant alien playing with marbles, and the marbles are just full of galaxies.
Yeah.
I believe we're inside of a marble, and we're absolutely finite and nothing in comparison to everything else that's out there. We're not worth it to even think of having this conversation about the finite thing. So.
And that could easily be the case, for all we know.
Yeah.
In my honest opinion, our primitive understanding of reality in the universe.
Yeah.
Dang. I never even heard about this. I had to Google it.
Yeah, there's actually a great YouTube channel, a quick plug over here called Kurzgesagt, called It's German for In a Nutshell. Fun little plug here. I actually got this in the mail finally from them the other day.
Oh, cool.
This is their Human Era 12,021 calendar I'm excited about. And the backstory in that is that, people think of the year 2021 without thinking of the fact that it is just a droplet in time. And they feel like, society started 10,000 years ago with like the Fertile Crescent, et cetera, or whatever it may have been. But it's just a good grounding of perspective, in my opinion. Like, we are significantly much more in our infancy than we actually think.
Yeah. Connor, I actually think about this issue like fairly frequently. And I want to say like the most obvious filter that we seem to have passed would be the Cold War, like nuclear Armageddon. We made it through. Like, if I think like if I were to travel back in time, would I change anything? Would I kill baby Hitler and all that? And I'm thinking like, with how close the Cold War was to killing us all, maybe I'm going to take my chances of letting all that bad stuff happen, right?
Yeah.
However, just because that's the past doesn't mean that the future can't change. Doesn't mean that we can't enter another Cold War. Doesn't mean that another nuclear winter can't happen. And nukes is just one of the easiest ways to be like, all right, yeah, humanity kills itself. That's not the only way. Yeah, that's not the only way that we can self-terminate. Far from it.
We also just simply trap ourselves on the planet too, to the point of space debris. What if we get to a point where we simply just can't get off?
Yeah, and speaking of the Cold War, like one of my favorite movies is 13 Days, and I understand it is pretty dramatized
like
what actually happened.
Yeah,
but like that just shows like there are easy opportunities to escalate a situation, and sometimes people don't realize about the fact like people talk about mutually assured destruction. I like to phrase it as a mutually assured suicide pact. Like, there are countless ways things can go wrong, and it is just unfortunate that people are more inclined to escalate a situation, to de-escalate a situation.
Yeah.
And given the time at the 60s, like, to get a message from Moscow and to DC and vice versa took hours. And that was a huge roadblock in the sense, like when a missile can reach the continental US in under 10 minutes, like you're going to want more instant communication with other world leaders to coordinate and collaborate in ways that, hey, let's not all kill each other off.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Sleep well tonight, everyone.
This conversation is making me play Solaris. I don't know if anyone's listening.
I'm like, bro, we're gonna all just die. Crap.
Hey, we're all gonna die eventually.
Dude, our podcast is like the most friendly, hey, we're all fucked podcast that you're ever gonna hear.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. This is a ton of fun, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you for your insights.
Yeah, man. That is a great note. Do you have any last thing you want to plug before you bounce, Connor?
Not Nothing too crazy. Yeah, I'll be launching this podcast here coming up in a couple weeks. Follow me on Twitter for more details. You can go to my website, connorbronsdon.com, CONORBRONSDON. Google me. I've got my email list and everything up there. So if you want to read my writing or follow what I'm doing, I'll be continuing to write about U.S. politics, about climate change, technology. And yeah, guys, thanks so much for having me on. I'd love to talk to you anytime. It's been a ton of fun.
It's been, yeah, we're all saying the same thing at the same time. It's been an absolute blast having you as well.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching as well.
Thanks, all. Yeah, thanks everyone for watching.
Yep.
Thank you, guys.